Jon Jones got it done. Jon Jones got it done indeed, and he did it in thrilling, quick fashion. Still wrapping my head around what we saw last night, the 2 minutes and whatever it was that the fight amounted to between Jon Jones and Cyril Gane. What's happening, everybody? You know the show. You know me, Ryan Thomas, the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Greatly appreciate you guys for tuning in to this UFC 285 post-fight reaction podcast. Jon Jones makes quick work of Cyril Gane last night at UFC 285. Don't call it a comeback, because I think last night's performance kind of reaffirmed the greatness of Jon Jones, why we know Jon Jones as one of the best fighters to ever put on a 4-ounce glove that has the three letters U, F, and C on it. Of course, you know, it hasn't been without trials and tribulations. As a fan, it's been very tough to be a fan of, in particular, Jon Jones over the last, 5-6 years. But one thing you can't deny is not only the trials and tribulations that Jon Jones has had, but you can't deny the talent. You can't deny the ability that Jon Jones has inside that octagon. And when the lights are brightest, that is when Jon Jones is at his peak performance. That's when Jon Jones is at his best. And that's when Jon Jones can do what he does best, and that is fight inside the UFC octagon. And leading up to this fight, I do the pre-fight show where I give my analysis and I tell people how I expect the fight to go down. And leading up to this fight, I did pick Jon Jones, of course, because he is one of the best fighters to ever do it. But of course, when the fight took place and it ended in the form and fashion that it did, I had to take a step back, on my drive home from going out watching it with the guys and the lady last night, to say just how great is this guy? Just how great could he have been? For as easy as it is right now in today's, hour of the day after the fight to say, Jon Jones is the best of all time, I think that's, a pretty easily stated claim nowadays, far too easily. People are saying this person's the best of all time, this person's the best of all time. It made me wonder, how many missed fights did we miss from Jon Jones over the last 3 years, let alone over the last, 5 or 6 years? It's no secret the amount of controversy that Jon Jones has, found himself in over the last decade. And it made me wonder, man, we've missed out on some opportunities as fight fans, but more so, not even just from a fanhood standpoint, but from a standpoint of Jon Jones, missing out on $1 million payday, $1 million payday, $1 million payday that he could have had it not been for his own struggles. Endorsements. At one point, there were fights back in the day where Jon Jones would walk out and he'd have a Nike logo on his trunks before the UFC was exclusively with Reebok and then with Venom. And you wonder, even in moments like that, could Jones have, made, McGregor money, essentially? I think he could have. And dare I say it, I think due to the fact that Jones had these transgressions, tribulations, mistakes, I think it opened the gates for Conor McGregor to kind of burst onto the scene more than he actually might have had Jones not, been out of the way, which he was out of the way. If Jones was essentially who he should have been for the sport, for the years that he needed to be for the sport, he would have found himself in a much better situation as far as his financial situation, as far as the star power, as far as the UFC and memories and all those things. All those boxes would have been checked off, but last night's performance was eye-opening, to say the least. And I want to talk about the fight itself in terms of eye-opening to me, in terms of Jon, and of course eye-opening to me in terms of Cyril Gane. And when you're looking at a fight, you got to evaluate both performances from both fighters You can't just look at the performance of one. You got to look at the performance of the man in defeat. Pardon me. And truthfully, I feel that this performance was one that was great from Jon. But moments leading up to the performance, one thing that I found to be very interesting was a curveball that was thrown towards Jon as he was making his way to the octagon where his toes were taped, which I hadn't remembered his toes ever being taped before. I know that he had that toe injury against Chael Sonnen, and ever since he's had quote-unquote toe problems, right? So going into that fight, seeing him walking into the octagon, they're taking the tape off of his toe. It looked like there was a little bit of a contentious moment there between Jon and the Nevada State Athletic Commission, and I thought, what's going to happen here? What's going on here? That happens. Jones still gets to enter into the octagon, still gets to, conduct his performance, of course. And, man, I thought physically Jones looked much bigger. But to be quite honest with you, I thought that the mass that he was able to build wasn't necessarily good mass. It was more of, he looked a little bit thicker, so to speak. Not necessarily, jacked or muscular as he was at 205. And you could attribute that to the PEDs that he could have potentially been on in prior fights or whatever it was back before the UFC had USADA, conducting consistent drug tests within the sport with the fighters, of course. But I thought his physique didn't look quite good, leading into this fight. When they posted pictures of Jones at heavyweight, I thought, man, he doesn't really look that good. Doesn't really look as good as I thought he would, with 3 years of preparation, moving up in weight. I thought, doesn't look that good. But I truthfully thought that this was an opportunity for all of us to see a really big seminal moment in the sport where the greatest ever at 205 pounds moves up to heavyweight and takes on a challenger that is dynamic, has tools, has talents that are very similar to Jon Jones. Footwork, great jab, moves really well in unbalanced, awkward situations for most fighters. I thought Cyril Gane was an interesting opponent for this fight. Did I think Cyril was going to win this fight? No, I did not. Did I think Jon Jones was going to make short work of Cyril Gane? I predicted second round TKO. It was a first round submission 2 minutes into the fight, right? So let's talk about this fight. The question for me in this fight, in the aftermath of Jon Jones and Cyril Gane, is a two-pronged question. Was Jon Jones that dominant last night, or was Gane just unprepared last night? Now, we're all going to fall in love with the dominance, and we're going to give Jon Jones his shine as far as what he was just able to accomplish, and we should, given that Jones did all the things that I just mentioned, took 3 years off, had a great career at light heavyweight, wasn't without adversity, of course, had a great career at light heavyweight. I thought he lost his last light heavyweight fight, against Dominic Reyes, who has gone on to really have a rocky road since he got that decision loss to Jon Jones. Hasn't been the same fighter in a fight that I thought he won, a fight that I thought Jones lost. The fight that put Jon Jones in the Hall of Fame, his first fight with Alexander Gustafsson, I thought he lost that fight as well, but undefeated at light heavyweight, that's on the record. Outside of the DQ loss to Matt Hamill in a fight that he was winning. It's the only quote-unquote loss on his record. All those things. Is this guy the GOAT? Was he just that dominant? Or was Gane just unprepared last night? And I want to go with the latter. I'm not trying to take away anything from Jon Jones, but Jon Jones threw at Cyril Gane what he has thrown at pretty much everybody that he's ever fought. Whether it's a weird, awkward kick to the knee, or a weird leg kick or a hook kick or anything like that. Jones was being awkward in there, and that's what he does very, very well, and that's why he's so tough to fight against. But he also shot in for a takedown, got the takedown with relative ease, and worked his way to a choke that was very similar to a tactic that he implemented in one of his last fights back in the day against Lyoto Machida. Now, that fight with Lyoto, Jon Jones and Lyoto, that was one that, okay, obviously Lyoto is like this Rubik's Cube of a fighter, and Jon was as well, is as well, always has been. There was a moment where Jon had Lyoto against the cage, opened up his forehead, they get to the feet, both of them, Lyoto works to his feet as he always has been known to do when he's got his back against the fence, and Jon and Lyoto get separated by Big John McCarthy, and then they're replaced back in the same position against the cage that they were from the moment the fight was stopped, of course. And I remember this very well. As soon as they were put back in that position, Jon Jones knew to find the neck and find the choke. He was able to do that, and moments thereafter the fight was stopped because Lyoto was sent crashing down to the canvas as Big John was looking at the choke and then sees Jon has the choke, sees Lyoto go limp, and Jones lets go, and Lyoto just crumbles to the canvas. We've all seen that, right? If you haven't, go check it out. Pretty insane. But this fight with Cyril Gane was very similar. It's just that the positioning was much different. The choke was similar, but Cyril Gane was obviously sitting on his butt with his back against the cage with no room to go. The only place he could have gone was potentially even deeper into the choke than he already was. At that point, by the time he knew that it was too deep, it was too late. There were movements that needed to happen from Gane that didn't, which allowed Jones to sink the choke in even tighter than it was. And there were moments in the fight where Jones was working in the guard of Gane in a very elementary way, and Gane was not moving at all. Was just still while Jones was working into his guard. Didn't try to build a base, didn't try to get to his feet, which is one of the first tactics that you learn in wrestling and or grappling, whether it's, MMA or wrestling. It was pretty astonishing to me, that moment of Jon Jones and his work in the guard of Cyril Gane, and to see Gane not really react whatsoever. I don't know if he knew where he was in the cage. Maybe he didn't know his back was that close to the fence. Maybe he thought he could push off. I don't know. It was very perplexing to me in terms of Cyril Gane's performance last night, almost to a point that it was awkward to watch that fight go down the way that it did, knowing what was on the line, knowing that one guy was fighting for something very important to him, and that the other guy should have been as well, but one guy looked like he was, the other guy looked like he wasn't, with how bad he looked, meaning Gane, last night, in the 2 minutes of action that we saw. The only thing that Cyril Gane was actually able to do successfully from the opening bell to the end of the fight was kick Jon Jones in the area. That's really the only thing that he was able to do in the entire fight. Other than that, Gane was extremely out of his element, looked lost in terms of the grappling department, completely unprepared, and yet he had 6 weeks, and that was the first thing that was asked of him after the fight. But I'm watching that post-fight press conference, and that's the first thing he says. I only had 6 weeks to prepare. Well, you knew at some point you'd be in the upper echelon of the heavyweight division. You knew potentially that Jon Jones could make a comeback. But you fought like that. You fought like that. And I truly feel that this should be the last time, for at least a long time, that we see Cyril Gane in a UFC title fight. Truthfully. I say that with all due respect. I'm not trying to kick a man while he's down. But with that type of performance, I really don't feel that Gane should fight anytime soon for a title. There's a lot of work to be done with Cyril Gane. And in terms of Jon Jones and his approach leading up to the fight, I thought he was almost disrespectful of the challenge that was Gane But now in hindsight, I actually feel like Jon Jones hit the nail on the head in terms of this guy's not on my level. This guy's nowhere near the fighter that Stipe Miocic is. He's nowhere near the fighter that Daniel Cormier is. And I agree with that. I'd agree with that early, prior to the fight. But I thought when Jon said that Cyril was unbalanced, I thought, well, he has been to date, but I don't think he will be for this one. I think he'll be prepared. And to be honest with you, he was not prepared in any way, shape, or form for Jon Jones. At least that's how it looked in the minutes. We can only judge the minutes of action that we saw. And when Jon got that choke and Cyril tapped relatively quickly, Cyril looked out into the lights of the arena and looked just as shocked as anyone. So I'm not trying to, kick a man while he's down, but at the same time, he didn't look like he was all there. He didn't look like even prior to getting taken down, the footwork wasn't there, the movement wasn't there that we've come to know from Cyril Gane. It looked like a completely different guy, and I can judge that even though it was only a 2-minute, and 20-second performance or whatever it was. It only lasted a couple minutes. There was a lot happened in those couple of minutes that led to the fight going the way that it did. Can take a lot of pieces from a fight that only lasted 2 minutes and 20 seconds, even though that's not a long time, of course. So the next question is, obviously Jones was dominant. Gane was unprepared for the dominance that Jon Jones can exhibit in a fight, and that's on Gane. Big ups to Jon Jones for the performance. But the next question is Jon Jones the greatest of all time, and he certainly has a case. I'm not going to sit here and say that Jon Jones doesn't belong in the conversation. That would be completely wrong of me to do that. But I think I'm finally at a point now where I'm old enough to where when I have these debates with guys that are older than me, in terms of Joe Montana versus Tom Brady, I say Tom Brady's better. And then they say Joe Montana. It's like, well, this or that. What's the difference, really? Outside of accomplishments, one's got more rings than the other, but other than that, what's the difference, right? Not that that's not a big deal, of course. We're talking about winning and sport and accomplishments, and the goal is to win as much as possible. Who won more than Tom Brady? Nobody. But in his own era, who won more than Joe Montana? And that's what makes things very tough when we talk about the greatest of all time. Jon Jones is 15-0 in world title fights. Jon Jones has no true loss on his record. As I mentioned, that DQ loss to Matt Hamill. But I'll go back to the original point that I made in terms of Jon Jones. Whenever I see Jon Jones in the cage and he produces the results that he does, I say what could have been to myself. Even though we've seen him fight, even though he hasn't necessarily fought on the regular these last 5 years. He's had a 2-year break once, he's had a 2-year break again, and he's had a 3-year break another time. So that's like 3 fights in 6 years, essentially. Whereas I go back to a guy that helped me cultivate a love for the sport, and that's the guy that I consider the greatest of all time. Whoever can help me really appreciate or love a sport is seen in a higher level, because that's the guy that helped bring me to where I am now as far as loving the sport as much as I do and enjoying the sport as much as I do and analyzing the sport as much as I do. And that's George StPierre. He'll always be the GOAT to me. My GOAT is George StPierre. But if you were to have every great fighter on one stage that is in that top 10 GOAT conversation, whether it's Jon Jones, George StPierre, Anderson Silva, BJ Penn, any one of those guys has a case. Just like Joe Montana has a case, just like Tom Brady has a case, just like Dan Marino has a case. All those guys have a case into making them the greatest of all time, but I do believe how you represented the sport should matter, especially in a sport that teaches honor, discipline, respect. And I will say that, and it sounds a little cheesy, it sounds a little corny, but it's very tough for me to say that the greatest of all time is a man that is not a great role model for this generation or the next, or any, rather. And that's just how I see that. And maybe that's just me, but I think a lot of people could agree with me on that. I think people will disagree with me on that, and that's okay. But that's just my opinion. I think Georges St-Pierre has done a phenomenal job being an ambassador for the sport in a positive way. And I think he did all the right things while he was competing. Granted, he's got 2 losses on his record, but the 2 guys that he lost to, Matt Hughes and Matt Serra, he avenged those losses. Against Matt Hughes twice, he avenged that one. 2-1 in the trilogy. And against Matt Serra, the second fight was one of the biggest one-sided, cans of whoop-ass that I've ever seen. And I love Matt Serra, but with all due respect, that wrong was righted after the second fight between GSP and Matt Serra. The wrong by GSP was righted in the second fight. Plus, I do think that there's moments in Jon Jones' career that, there are wins on his record, but there were some decisions over the years that were very close. Alexander Gustafsson, the first fight, very close fight. Thiago Santos, the first fight, obviously he didn't fight him twice, but the next close fight, I should say, against Thiago Santos, that was a split decision. And I thought there were moments that Santos was definitely winning the fight, albeit that's why it was a split decision. And then Jones's last fight at light heavyweight against Dominic Reyes, I truly was astonished that Jones got the decision for that fight. I thought Reyes won that fight. And I think Jones even knew that, okay, wow, light heavyweight, maybe I'm slowing down in terms of my speed that I could offer to the light heavyweight competition when I was fighting guys like Chael and Shogun and Rashad and Quentin Rampage Jackson and Lyoto Machida. When I was going through all those names, I was faster than all those guys. But now I'm in this younger tier of light heavyweights that I'm going up against, and I'm not as fast as I was. Not as nimble as I was. So I'm going to move up to heavyweight. There's new challenges there. The fighters are slower. I'll be faster than those guys. And I'll be able to kind of hit the reset button on all the light heavyweight stuff, as well as including the past transgressions that I had at light heavyweight. And that is refreshing about this. That Jones is the heavyweight champion of the world, UFC heavyweight champ, and he's a guy that does have a new opportunity to hit the reset button, right some wrongs, and be a better man this time around as a champion at 35. And let's be honest, if you're 35 years old and doing the stuff that you were doing in your early 20s, that's not good, right? That's pretty pathetic, right? So I'd like to hope, and I'd say it like this, I'd like to hope that Jon Jones will have learned from his past transgressions and that he will be a better person this time around as a champion, representing not only the worldwide leader in mixed martial arts, the UFC, but most importantly himself. So we don't have to watch his fights and then think, man, we had some missed opportunities with that guy. Man, that guy could have been better than what he was. Obviously, it's really tough to say that when this guy, my personal preference of the GOAT is Georges St-Pierre, but if I didn't have the fanhood allegiance to Georges St-Pierre that I do have, I would say Jones is the best. If I didn't see the GSP era from start to finish like I did, I would say Jones is the best. Just based on his acumen in the octagon, of course, and what he accomplished in the octagon, right? But I'm going with GSP, man. I'm going with GSP. That's my guy. Fanhood aside, I think he did more for the sport than Jon has. And I think that that's pretty easy to figure out when you see the lapses and breaks. And George took a 4-year break. The pressure of being a champ was just getting to be too much. Took a break, and comes back after 4 years and fights Bisping and wins the UFC middleweight title and rides off into the sunset. The greatest send-off that you could ever have. Jon Jones isn't going anywhere, though, because he needs to add to his name. Despite everything we've mentioned about him being 15-0 in world title fights, youngest UFC champion ever, never been finished, of course, never been beaten by anybody, there were gaps in that Jon Jones era that need to be filled, and they need to be filled with accolades at heavyweight. And yeah, I'm going to sit here and say, even though he just won the title, Jon Jones' accomplishments to date, the resume of who he's beaten is pretty startling. The way he beat the guys that he beat is pretty startling, but I feel like George StPierre brought like that super athlete to the forefront to where it kind of paved the way for guys like Jon Jones. Granted, I think the GSP era started a little bit sooner than the Jones era. They both collided in terms of, it was GSP, Anderson Silva, then Jones came along, then Conor came along. So that's kind of how I see that. And I truly believe that Jones still does have some room to make in terms of being in that 1A conversation of being the best to ever do it. For me, George's resume is just as good, if not better, than Jones's. George's resume, rather, if I didn't say that, George's resume is better than Jon Jones in terms of my opinion and just how I see it, in terms of it's just as impressive, if not more impressive. I think George fought guys that were killers when they were fighting, whereas Jones was fighting guys that were definitely dynamic, but they had somewhat of their run. Rashad Evans, he had his run. Quentin Rampage, he had his run. Rampage Jackson, of course. Lyoto Machida, he had been defeated by Shogun, who Jones beat for the title. So there's a little bit of nitpicking going on here. But at the same time, I feel like Jones needs to do more as a heavyweight to cement his status as the best. And, he's going to get the opportunity to do that. What's next? Well, what's next is, in terms of making Jones the best, Jones versus Miocic. And I posted a status in regards to this yesterday. And the first person to comment on it was my dad. And I said, just the simple fact that Stipe Miocic is going to get the shot at Jon Jones. Or the winner of Jon Jones and Cyril Gane, which in hindsight, it was always going to be Jones. I mean, the way Gane looked in that fight was so bad. I've never seen anything quite like it. But this is a big one for the sense of, the comment that my dad made was why? Why is this fight happening? Why is Miocic getting an opportunity against Jon Jones? And I had to think about it for a second as to why would he make that comment? Because that's really the only fight that there is to make. And why would he feel that Miocic isn't a rightful opponent? Like, I'm wondering why is why being stated, right? But then the more I thought about it, in terms of like marketing and business and putting a fight together that makes sense for the fans, Jones versus Miocic is the next fight to make, and that makes sense in that regard. But what doesn't make sense about it is this whole Francis Ngannou equation that I think is not done. I'm not solely set on the idea that Francis Ngannou is out of the conversation completely within the UFC and that he'll never fight in the UFC again. Dana seems pretty hell-bent on saying that and fluffing up Jon Jones right now, because Jon Jones is really the only draw that the UFC has right now, despite the transgressions, despite the breaks in action, despite all those things that I've mentioned throughout this podcast. Dana is desperate for any sort of a sign that there is a draw. He is completely desperate. And you see that in the way he's promoted Jones over the years. Promoted him and knocked him down. Promoted him and knocked him down. And a lot of that is on Jon Jones too, but in moments where Dana could have promoted Jones and built him back up again, he chose not to do that when he had guys like Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic to lean on. But Francis comes along after Miocic bests Daniel Cormier in a trilogy. Francis comes along in the rematch with Stipe and sends him into the stratosphere, into the shadow realm, with a highlight reel knockout that we have not seen Stipe Miocic come back from. Like, we have not seen Stipe fight since that happened. So you're going to bring back a guy that got knocked out by the champion that never lost his belt, that you couldn't re-sign because you didn't want to pay him the money that he felt he was worth. So you put a fight together with Jon Jones and Cyril Gane, the guy in Gane that Ngannou beat in his last fight. So Jones could beat him. And then Jones now fights Stipe. It's a little bit of a head scratcher in terms of you're trying to build up a draw at heavyweight in Jon Jones because he's the only one you got. You can only work with the options that you have in Gane and Stipe, and I do think Stipe does have the capability to beat Jon Jones, but a lot of things have to happen in order for Stipe to beat Jon Jones. And the fact that Stipe is coming off of this loss to Francis and he hasn't fought since is alarming. The fact that Stipe is older now than he was when he got knocked out by Francis, because he hasn't, obviously time has passed since then, is alarming. The fact that Stipe hasn't fought since Francis and Gane fought is alarming. This is Stipe's first fight in what? Potentially, this fight will happen in July, right? And this is going to be billed as a GOAT versus GOAT fight. And, you could say the GOAT at light heavyweight, you could say the GOAT at heavyweight, the GOAT at light heavyweight Jon Jones, the GOAT at heavyweight Stipe. You could say those things, and you'd be right. But, truthfully, the fact that Stipe Miocic has not fought since he lost to Francis Ngannou, to me, is extremely concerning. And Stipe is 40 years old. By the time he fights Jon Jones, he'll be 1 month away from being 41. And the fight against Francis, I had to look up the date, was 2 years ago. March of 2021. Hasn't fought since. It's been a long time. So, this is the fight to make, but is it the fight that is going to sell a massive amount of pay-per-views? You got Jon Jones involved, it should do well. But is this fight as big as Jones versus Francis? Not even close. Not even in the same department. Not even anywhere near as good a fight as what Francis and Jones would be. And I think that's a great fight because I really believe there's only one guy on the planet in mixed martial arts that has the potential to beat Jon Jones, and that's Francis. Everybody else, it's like, okay, they'd have to have moments XYZ go in their favor in order to beat Jon Jones. But Francis, I think, could easily make that happen. I think Jones could beat Francis as well, but that's why it's a good fight. Whereas this fight, the reasons that Miocic can win are a lot less likely than they would be if Francis were to fight Jones. I want to know if you guys agree with me or disagree with me on that. Which fight would you rather see? Francis versus Jones or Jones versus Stipe Miocic? I want to hear your thoughts. Fire away some comments. Feel free. I appreciate the support. And if you don't make a comment on the live broadcast on YouTube, the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, or Facebook, the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, you can tweet at me at Ryan Thomas Take. Hit the follow button on that. I love Twitter for all the sports reasons. Other than that, they can toss all those other reasons aside. But where are your guys' heads at as far as last night? Were you impressed by Jones? Were you unimpressed by Cyril Gane like I was? I just can't believe Gane fought like that. I didn't see any urgency in there. And maybe it was so early in the fight that he just felt like he wasn't going to lose it. But time is money, like the longer the fight goes, there's more of a chance that, well, not even that. I say it in that way, but I'll also say it in this way. If it's the first round of a fight, you're both very dry. So it's harder for a guy to slip off of you, right? Because they don't have that sweat in between the two of you. And Gane just looked like, oh, I'll get out of this. And then he was not. The fight was over. It was unbelievable. But truthfully, I want to make this point known. You can't call it a comeback because Jon Jones has been here for years. We know how great the guy is inside the cage. I really hope the best for this guy. I really want him to be what I always thought he could be for mixed martial arts and for the UFC. I feel like if Jon Jones has another instance of a moment of trouble, I'll be very disappointed again in hearing any sort of news like that. I hope the best for him. I want him to be a great heavyweight champion. I want him to accomplish all the goals that he has, and walk out of the sport knowing that he contributed a lot to the sport as best as he could with the time that he had. Leave no stone unturned. That's always the tagline that I like to say. And leave it all in there. Is the best of Jon Jones even seen yet? I can't even quite make that statement. Because at heavyweight, there's so many opportunities for him. I mean, I think a fight that's really entertaining and one that I'd really like to see is a fight between Jon Jones and Sergey Pavlovich, as well a fight between Jon Jones and Curtis Blades. Now, those names aren't known names to the widespread of fan, but with a name like Jon Jones, you could put him in there with anybody. Jones has created this legacy that people will tune in to see him fight because he's a great fighter. When the people tune in, they don't care if Jon Jones is a great person or not. They want to see Jon Jones fight as a great fighter, right? And I think that those fights are challenges to Jon Jones. I want to see Jon Jones get challenged at heavyweight. And, most people thought Gane was that challenge, or Francis. Gane was not. We know he's not fighting Francis at least anytime soon. Is Stipe Miocic that challenge? We'll see. I doubt it, but crazier things have happened. Crazier things have happened. I think Jones has a completely new set of motivation. I look at how Jones was able to get through Gane looking the way he looked, which I didn't think physically he looked that great. And now Jon goes back to the drawing board in March, relatively untouched from his fight with Cyril Gane. And he goes in there, back into the gym, and he's fresh as a daisy. He can go back in the gym, work on what he needs to work on as far as his physical peak fitness at heavyweight. Now you got more time because you weren't injured in your fight with Cyril Gane that I know of. And you can prepare and get your body right for Stipe. And I think Jones's mentality right now, and all the interviews that I've watched since he fought Gane and beat Gane, which there's quite a few out there, ESPN, just MMA blogs and stuff, catching him in the arena as he was leaving and things of that nature. His mindset against Stipe is that he's not just going to fight Stipe, he's going to dominate Stipe and beat him within the first 3 rounds of the fight. And what makes me think that that's not going to happen? Is there anything that makes me think that that's not going to happen? I'd have to see some sort of training reel of Stipe Miocic lifting a Mack truck over his head in order for me to feel that Stipe has much of a shot. And maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh here, but Stipe has not fought in 2 years. He's 40, and the last fight that he fought in, he was devastatingly knocked out. One of the most vicious knockouts I've ever seen. So it's very hard for me to say that Stipe is going to beat Jon Jones. Do I think Jon Jones is going to knock out Stipe Miocic? I don't think so, because Jon is not known as that guy that Ngannou is, as far as being a slugger and things of that nature. But I think Jon Jones could systematically break Stipe down and win that fight. And I think Jon Jones, as well, his game plan should be much different at heavyweight than it was at light heavyweight. The game plan for Jones should simply be, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to use my wrestling against these heavyweights, and I'm not going to take too many big shots because I don't want to take shots from bigger men. That's not why I came up to heavyweight. I came up to heavyweight to win fights. And the best way for Jones to do that is in a methodical way that only he knows how. Wrestle, grapple, elbows, wacky, spinny, all that stuff that we've seen Jon Jones do over the last 10, 12 years when he is ready to compete. A lot to unpack here, and this is fun. You know, it's fun to have this discussion finally. You know, it feels good to have this discussion finally. It's good for MMA. It's good for Jon Jones, of course, and it's a long time coming. I sincerely hope that Jon Jones is going to be okay from here on out, and we don't have any issues moving forward, and we do see Jones fight Stipe July 8th, International Fight Week. That is something that I think is really, all these moments, whether I feel like they should or shouldn't happen, whether I feel like the build-up to Jones and Miocic is a little thin in terms of anticipation for me, it is a moment in the sport that is one more moment, and that's great. So with that, of course, I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Great interaction here from the people on Facebook and YouTube. I really appreciate the YouTube audience chiming in as well. I see I got some viewers mostly from YouTube, which is great. I want you guys to hit the subscribe button. Each and every fight night, each and every pay-per-view, you'll get pre- and post-fight analysis from yours truly. Chime in, be a part of the show. I look forward to having some Legacy Fighting Alliance fighters on my show in the coming weeks as the Legacy Fighting Alliance returns to Seneca Niagara Casino in Niagara Falls, New York, which is right near my backyard. And I'm really looking forward to that event. I'll be in attendance, of course. And there's a lot of great fighters on that card, up-and-coming talent in the sport of mixed martial arts. Greatly appreciate the love and support from the mixed martial arts fans out there, combat sports fans, boxing. You got Tank Davis and Ryan Garcia. I haven't even talked about that yet in terms of just my thoughts on that fight. That'll be a great boxing match. I'm looking forward to hopefully Fury versus Alexander Usyk. I'm hearing rumblings of Deontay Wilder versus Francis Ngannou, and the rumblings are starting to get louder and louder and louder. So a lot to unpack. 2 weeks away from a great trilogy matchup between Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman. Cannot wait for that fight. That's going to be a great, great build-up. The second fight was unbelievable. The way Leon Edwards landed that head kick and knocked out Kamaru Usman. I'll never forget that. Once again, another MMA moment, that makes me say, holy shit, there's been a lot of these, and I want more of them, for sure. So I really appreciate you guys tuning in. I'm Ryan Thomas. Of course, this is the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Thank you so much, and tune in next time.